Please help our mom, she's dying." A desperate cry tore through the night. As Shaquille O'Neal slammed on the brakes, the SUV skidding to a stop on the icy road. He rushed out and saw two children, shivering in the cold, their eyes filled with fear. They pulled him into an old mobile home, where a woman lay unconscious on the floor, her breath faint in her cold, lifeless hand. A small object gleamed under the dim light. A police badge worn and scratched with time. Shaq froze. He knew her. As the past hit him like a storm, one question echoed in his mind. Who was trying to take these children? Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and don't forget to subscribe, so you won't miss the upcoming events. The winter night fell cold and silent. Snowflakes drifting down and covering the quiet streets of the small town of Hollow Creek. In the stillness, only the howling wind through the bare trees and the flickering street lights cast shadows on the frozen road. Shaquille O'Neal, former NBA legend, now a successful businessman and philanthropist, was driving his Cadillac Escalade SUV through the town. The massive vehicle glided smoothly, and inside Shaq was enjoying a rare moment. Free from the spotlight or the press, he gently rubbed his stomach, thinking about finding a late-night diner to treat himself to a hearty meal. A huge burger or a plate of smoked ribs. The thought made him smile softly. But that small joy was quickly interrupted. Out of the darkness, two small children rushed from the sidewalk and stopped right in front of the car. Shaq slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the icy road with a screech. His heart raced, and his whole body tensed under the bright headlights. The sight before him froze his blood. A boy about 7 years old was tightly holding a girl around 4, both shivering in thin pajamas. They were barefoot, their tiny feet purple from the cold, their breath visible in the frigid air. Tears glistened on their cheeks, blending with the bruised skin. The boy stared directly into Shaq's eyes, his expression full of panic and desperation. "Uncle, my mom is going to die," Tyler yelled, his voice hoarse from the cold and fear. Shaq didn't hesitate for a second. He threw the door open and stepped out. But because he was so tall, 7 feet 1 inch, the kids only came up to his thighs. So he had to kneel down, bringing his eyes level with Tyler's. Shaq looked straight into the boy's eyes, his breath quick but his voice steady and deep. "Where's your mom?" Tyler didn't hesitate. He grabbed Shaq's strong arm, his small hand cold and trembling from the chill. "Come with me, hurry." Shaq didn't wait. He let the boy lead him into the darkness, toward the old mobile home, where a painful past awaited him. It didn't take long for Shaq to realize something was wrong, as he followed Tyler through the narrow, dim alleys heading into an old, run-down mobile home hidden in the darkness. Broken-down cars were scattered along the side of the road, the windows of some houses boarded up with rotten wood. No lights, no sign of life. The air carried a desolate, cold feeling, making Shaq feel like he was stepping into a forgotten place, where hope had been crushed long ago. Tyler pushed open the creaky wooden door, the hinges screeching as if the house itself were dying, along with the person inside. As soon as the light from the hallway shone in, Shaq froze on the cold floor. A woman lay motionless, her body curled up from the cold, her weak breaths barely audible. She wore a thin sweater, not nearly enough to keep her warm in this biting cold. Her face was pale, eyes tightly shut, dark circles under her eyes deeply etched, a sign of exhaustion and endless sleepless nights. Shaq took out his phone, turned on the flashlight, and shined it on the woman's hand. Her fingers were tightly gripping something, a police badge scratched and worn over the years. He froze. Flashes of memories rushed back, pulling him to a time long ago, a time he thought he had left behind forever. He stared at the woman's face. A face he had once known better than anyone. Lauren Carter. The name hit Shaq's mind hard, pulling him back to 15 years ago, when they were both young, full of dreams and hope, when she was still a strong, resilient police officer, not so easily broken as she was now. Shaq's face turned pale. Why was she here? Why was someone once so strong, now lying motionless in this dilapidated house? Before he could find an answer, Tyler grabbed his shirt, his eyes wide with terror. His voice shook, almost lost in the cold and despair. Mom's been coughing all night. She didn't wake up today. Please help my mom. Shaq didn't hesitate for a second. He knelt down, wrapping his arms around Lauren's frail body, and lifted her as if she were weightless. She was lighter than he had imagined. Light enough to make his heart tighten. He moved quickly outside, pushed open the SUV door, gently laid her in the back seat, pulled a jacket over her, and checked her breathing again. There was no time to waste. He slammed the door, stepped on the gas, and the Cadillac Escalade roared to life. Speeding down the snow-covered road, the engine roaring powerfully as if it too sensed the urgency of the situation. Street lights passed by in moments, in the rearview mirror, illuminating Tyler's frantic eyes as he turned around, his gaze never leaving his mother. He didn't blink, as if fearing that if he looked away for even a second, Lauren would disappear forever. Eva clung to Shaq's massive arm, her tiny fingers digging into him, as if afraid to lose her only support. Tyler's voice was small but carried the horrifying fear no child should ever have to experience. Uncle, will my mom be okay? Shaq gripped the steering wheel tightly, eyes focused on the road ahead. But his mind held on to one promise. Your mom will be okay, I promise. He pressed the accelerator harder. Not far away, in the darkness of the cold mobile home park, a figure watched everything. Hiding behind an old car, with its windows covered in frost. His cold eyes never left the SUV, as it disappeared down the highway. He had been waiting all night, observing every move, waiting for the right moment. He thought he wouldn't need to intervene, that Lauren would finally fall, without his hand ever touching her. But then the giant appeared, pulling her out of his reach, ruining all the plans he had carefully laid out. Martin Wells stubbed out his cigarette, crushing it under his heel, his eyes unblinking, as he watched the red lights of the SUV fade. 6 years ago he had lost everything. He lost power, freedom, and the child he considered his possession. He swore he would get it all back. Martin took out his phone, his long fingers typing a brief message. He had a plan, and Shaquille O'Neal had just unwittingly stepped into a war that Martin had been ready to finish for a long time. The sound of the ambulance siren had faded, but the beat in Shaq's chest still pounded as though he had just finished the most intense game of his career. In the cold emergency room, under the harsh white fluorescent lights, he sat in the waiting area, with 2 children huddled close to him, their breath still trembling from fear. Tyler clung to his arm, as if any loosening would send the boy spiraling into some nightmare. Ava curled into his chest, her tiny hand clutching the collar of his shirt, unwilling to let go. Shaq tightened his large hand around the children's shoulders, feeling every little shiver they made. Throughout his life he had been through countless games, facing overwhelming pressure from millions of viewers. But he had never felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, like he did now. This wasn't a game that could be solved with physical strength or skill. This was a battle for trust, for protection, for a promise he couldn't let break. A doctor stepped out of the exam room holding a file. His face was serious and his eyes glanced over Shaq, before settling on the children. "We've checked everything. Miss Carter has severe pneumonia. And her body is in critical condition. If she hadn't been brought in on time, she might not have made it." Shaq clenched his teeth, feeling anger rise within him. How could someone like Lauren, a former cop, end up like this? A woman who was once strong, resilient, who had stood on the front lines to protect the vulnerable, now struggling to survive in a shabby trailer, while her 2 kids huddled against the cold. What had forced her to live in such harsh conditions? What was she running from? Shaq didn't need to ask, he knew the answer. The darkness in Tyler's eyes. The fear in every little movement. The bruises on Lauren's wrists that were fading, but still left marks, all pointed to one name. Martin Wells. Shaq took a deep breath, holding back his rage, though the fire within him still burned. He bent down and to pull the blanket up for Eva, as she began rubbing her eyes. Then gently placed a hand on Tyler's shoulder, to reassure him, but just then, a voice broke the fragile peace in his mind. "Sorry, Mr. O'Neill, but I need to speak with you about the children situation." Shaq turned. A middle-aged woman with neatly tied brown hair and a sharp face was looking at him. She wore a dark business suit, holding a folder in her hand. Her eyes were sharp but not completely cold. They held a hint of empathy, though they were filled with determination. "I'm Lisa Monroe, a child welfare worker," she introduced briefly. "Right now, the children's mother is in critical condition. And if she can't care for them, I will have to place them into foster care, according to the procedure." Immediately Shaq felt Tyler tense up. The boy gripped his arm tighter, his fingers going pale from the force of his grip. His eyes were wide, filled with absolute terror, as if he had just heard a death sentence. "Uncle, please don't let them take me away from Eva," Tyler whispered, his voice shaking but filled with determination. He turned to Lisa, his eyes shimmering with tears. But his small voice carried a strength that even adults would find hard to resist. "We can't be separated. I'm Ava's brother. I promised our mom I'd always protect her." Lisa blinked, as if moved by the desperation in Tyler's voice. But no matter how much empathy she felt, she was still a social worker, and the law didn't work on emotions. Shaq couldn't let this happen. He bent down, his warm brown eyes locking onto Tyler's. And when he spoke, it wasn't just words. It was a vow carved deep into his soul. "No one's taking you anywhere as long as I'm here. I promise." The boy looked at him, still full of worry. But for a brief moment Shaq saw a spark of hope. A little bit of trust. A belief that, for the first time in a long while, the boy didn't have to face the world alone. But Shaq knew that this promise couldn't just be words. He would have to fight to keep it. And this fight had only just begun. The pale white light from the hospital lamp cast a soft glow on Lauren's tired face, as she slowly opened her eyes. The room was quiet, with only the steady, monotonous beeping of the heart monitor filling the air. She took a breath, her chest aching with every slight movement. The illness had drained her energy, but the fear had eaten away at her from within. For many years, and then she saw him. Shaq sat right beside the bed, his broad shoulders seeming to fill the space around him. His large hand gripped his knee tightly, as though he was trying to keep himself calm. But Lauren knew Shaquille O'Neal better than anyone. His face might seem calm, but the fury in his eyes couldn't hide the anger boiling inside. "Lauren, what the hell happened?" His voice was low but laced with tension. Lauren closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to gather the strength to face What she knew she could no longer escape. When she opened her eyes she looked straight at Shaq. Her voice hoarse from the illness, but still carrying the determination of a woman who had fought for many years. "Tyler is not your son," she whispered, immediately sensing the shift in Shaq's gaze. He froze but said nothing. Lauren took a deep breath, a sudden cough shaking her body. Shaq reached out as if to help, but she raised her hand to stop him. She needed to say this, she needed him to understand. "Tyler is Martin Wells's son." The name fell into the air, like a stone sinking into a deep abyss. Shaq gritted his teeth, his jaw clenching so tightly that his muscles stood out clearly. The name echoed in his mind like a warning bell, awakening all the memories he had tried to forget. He had heard of Martin Wells, knew who he was, but he never imagined that monster would be connected to Lauren's life. "He's an abuser," Lauren continued, her voice breaking at the end. "He tortured me not just physically, but mentally. When I was pregnant with Tyler, I knew I couldn't let my child grow up with a father like that. I ran away. Changed my name, changed my life. Did everything I could so that Tyler would never know him." Shaq could see the pain etched deep in her eyes. But what made him truly furious was what Lauren said next. "He's out of prison." A jolt of electricity ran through Shaq. He sat up straight, his hands pressing into his knees, his eyes sharp as knives. "And now he's trying to take Tyler back." Lauren nodded, her hands gripping the hospital blanket, as if it were the only thing holding her together. "He's been asking about the kids. I know he won't stop. He wants custody of Tyler. Not because he cares about him, but because he refuses to lose. He's never accepted me leaving him." Shaq felt the anger inside him flare up like a fire. His hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles cracked. "That bastard thinks he can be Tyler's father." Shaq snarled through clenched teeth, his voice low, almost a growl. "No way." Lauren looked at him, confusion in her eyes, but also hope. She hadn't thought about seeking help. So many years of running had made her distrustful of everyone. But this was Shaq, the man she had once loved. The man she never thought would come back at a time like this. Yet he was here just when she needed him most. Shaq stood up, his shadow casting over Lauren's hospital bed. When he spoke, it was no longer a mere statement, but a declaration of war. "I will protect these kids at all costs." Lauren looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude, but also concern. Martin is not an easy person to deal with, Shaq. He won't just give up. Shaq bent down, his deep brown eyes staring intently into hers, and Lauren saw in them an unwavering determination. "He can try." Outside the hospital, a black car was parked not far away. Martin Wells sat inside, his cigarette burning halfway, the red glow from the ember reflecting in his cold, snake-like eyes. He smirked as he saw the Cadillac Escalade SUV parked near the hospital entrance. "So you think you can protect them from me, Shaq?" He muttered, the smoke curling up into the cold air. "You have no idea how patient I've been." He ground out his cigarette, throwing it out the car window, his gaze darkening. The real battle had only just begun. From the hospital window, Shaq could see the first rays of sunlight piercing through the cold mist. A new day had arrived, but there was no relief in his heart. Lauren still lay in the hospital bed, weak, but her condition was gradually stabilizing. Tyler and Ava were fast asleep on the couch in the room, curled up in the blanket the nurse had given them. Shaq sat there watching the two children, his mind revolving around an undeniable truth. This fight would not just stay in the shadows. It had stepped into the light. Martin Wells was not only an abuser, but also a cunning fox, who knew how to exploit the legal system. Less than 24 hours after Lauren was admitted to the hospital, he filed a petition with the court, demanding custody of Tyler. He argued that he was the biological father of the boy, and that Lauren was no longer capable of taking care of him. Shaq read the document from his lawyer, his hand tightening around the paper, until it nearly tore. He actually dared to do this. If Martin thought that Shaq would stand by and watch him take Tyler away from Lauren, then he had picked the wrong opponent. The courtroom was vast but carried a heavy, suffocating atmosphere. The shiny wooden benches reflected the glaring lights, and stacks of legal files towered in front of the judge. In one corner of the room, Shaq sat upright, his eyes never leaving Martin Wells before. Everything began. The two men locked eyes. Martin appeared neat in a gray suit, his hair carefully styled, his face bearing an expression of regret, as if he were truly a good father, trying to make up for his past mistakes. But Shaq was not fooled. He could play the victim. He could act in front of the judge, but his eyes couldn't conceal his true nature. The trial began. Martin's lawyer stood up, speaking in a convincing tone, as though he were a devoted father, trying to redeem his past wrongs. "Your Honor," he began, "my client has changed. He has rehabilitated well after his time in prison, has a stable job, and has not committed any further offenses. He just wants the chance to be Tyler's father, to make up for the lost years." Shaq watched silently. He didn't say a word, but his eyes spoke volumes. Contempt, protection, resolve, all were visible in his gaze. When it was Martin's turn to testify, he placed his hands on the table, letting out a small sigh, as if he were trying to hold back pain. "Tyler is my son," he said in a deep, sorrowful voice. "I admit I was wrong in the past, but I've paid for that. I don't want my son growing up without a father." A perfect performance. But when Lauren's lawyer stood up, Martin's game began to unravel. Lauren's hospital records were presented as evidence, showing the past injuries she had endured. The hospital visits for falls that were actually the result of beatings from the very man standing in court today. "Mr. Wells," Lauren's lawyer said coldly, "if you truly love your child, then why did the mother of the child have to flee from you for the past 7 years?" Martin clenched his lips but could not respond. After strong arguments from both sides, the judge called Tyler to testify. The air in the room suddenly grew still, as the boy stood up, his small footsteps echoing in the silent space. He walked up to the stand, his bright eyes unwavering. "Do you know why you are here today?" the judge asked in a calm, steady voice. Tyler took a deep breath, then lifted his head high. "Because Martin says he's my father," the boy replied, his voice steady. "But he's not." A small whisper spread through the courtroom. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Then who is taking care of you?" Tyler turned his head, searching for a familiar face. When he saw Shaq, he smiled gently and then faced the judge again. "Uncle Shaq." The entire courtroom fell silent. "Uncle Shaq is the one who takes care of me, not Martin," Tyler said, his voice stronger than ever. "He protects me, takes care of me and Ava when I'm scared. He makes me feel safe." Shaq felt his chest tighten. Martin clenched his fists, his eyes burning with anger, but he couldn't do anything. The judge slammed the gavel down on the table, his expression stern. After reviewing all the evidence, I ruled that the legal guardianship of Tyler Wells will be awarded to Lauren Carter. Additionally, considering Mr. Wells's unstable living conditions and history of abuse, the court denies him visitation rights. The verdict rang out like a death sentence. For Martin Wells, he roared, slamming both hands down on the table. No, I won't let this happen. Immediately, 2 security officers moved in to restrain him. But his eyes remained filled with hatred, as he glared at Shaq as if he wanted to devour him. Shaq stood up facing him. This time he didn't need to say a word. Martin looked at him, then sneered slightly, and whispered just loud enough for Shaq to hear. The game's not over yet. Shaq didn't respond, only clenched his fist tighter. He knew Martin wouldn't give up easily. But for now Tyler and Eva were safe. And no matter what happened next, Shaq knew he would never let Martin touch the kids again. The battle might not be over, but today Shaq had won. The atmosphere in the courtroom remained tense as Shaq stepped into the hallway, walking slowly but with certainty. Lauren walked beside him, one hand tightly gripping Eva, while Tyler stayed close to Shaq, as if the boy couldn't bear to leave his side for even a second. They had just gone through an unwanted legal battle, but at least justice had prevailed. But Shaq knew, with someone like Martin Wells, the court's verdict was never the final word. The courthouse parking lot was cold and empty. Weak winter sunlight stretched across the concrete, reflecting off Shaq's Cadillac Escalade. He opened the car door, ready for everyone to get in. But at that moment a voice rang out from behind, tearing through the silence. Tyler is my son. Shaq spun around. Martin Wells stood there, his breath coming out in white puffs, his eyes bloodshot like a wild animal cornered. He had lost everything in a single day, but still couldn't accept the truth. He squinted at Shaq stumbling forward, but with dangerous intent. His hands clenched into fists, as though ready to strike at any moment. You think you can steal my son? Martin hissed, his voice full of rage. You think just because you're famous, a big muscular guy, you can replace me? I don't care what the court says. That kid belongs to me. Shaq said nothing he didn't need to. He stood there tall like a steel wall, his gaze calm but sharp, staring directly at Martin, as though silently warning him. In Martin's world, men fought with power, violence and threats, but for Shaq, none of that mattered. Martin growled, unable to bear the silence. He lunged forward, his fist raised, aimed directly at Shaq's face with all the fury he had. But Shaq only needed one simple move. He raised a hand, blocking Martin, as he would block a weaker player on the court, holding him back easily, as if Martin were just a child struggling with an adult. Martin struggled, trying to break free, but Shaq's strength was like steel. Let Mr. go, he screamed, his face red with anger and humiliation from being so effortlessly subdued. You have no right to call that boy your son, Shaq said slowly, each word clear and deliberate. You have no right to be a father, when you abandoned him from the very start. And you will never lay a hand on Tyler again. Martin continued to struggle, but the difference in strength was undeniable. At that moment, the sound of police sirens cut through the air, drowning out Martin's frantic screams. 2 officers stepped out of the nearby patrol car, tasers ready in hand. Let go of him, Mr. O'Neill, one of the officers shouted. Shaq slowly released Martin, pushing him back a step. Martin stumbled, but refused to give up. You can't arrest me, he yelled at the officers, I'm just trying to get my son back. Mr. Wells. You violated a restraining order and assaulted someone. One officer said coldly, pulling out handcuffs. You are under arrest. Martin kept struggling, but this time the police officer's grip wasn't as gentle as Shaq's. He was forced down onto the car's hood. Handcuffs locked behind his back. His face contorted with rage he could no longer express. Shaq didn't take his eyes off him, waiting until the police car door slammed shut, taking Martin Wells out of Tyler's life once and for all. He exhaled, turning to look at Lauren, Tyler and Eva. Lauren was holding the two children tightly, her face still pale from fear. But in her eyes there was something else. Something Shaq had never seen since reuniting with her. Trust. Tyler stepped out of Lauren's embrace and ran toward Shaq. The boy hugged him tightly. So tightly that Shaq could feel the rapid beat of his little heart. Uncle, he won't come back, right? Tyler asked quietly, his voice trembling but full of hope. Shaq placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, bending down to his level, his gaze gentle yet certain. Number. He will never come back. Tyler looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. A small smile appeared on his face. The smile of a child who finally felt safe. Shaq straightened up, looking down the road, where the police car had just disappeared. He knew this story wasn't necessarily over. But one thing he could be sure of. He would never let Martin Wells come back again. Because now he wasn't just a protector. He was family. The Cadillac Escalade rolled down the suburban road, leaving behind the small town, where Lauren and her two kids had struggled for years. Tyler and Ava sat in the back seat, their eyes fixed on the window, watching the muddy trails and small mobile homes slowly fade away. Lauren still needed to stay at the hospital for further treatment, but she felt much more at ease, knowing Shaq would take care of the kids. For the first time in years, she could truly rest. Tyler tightly held onto his small backpack, the only possession he had, and glanced over at Eva, who had fallen asleep, her head resting on his shoulder. Shaq glanced at the rearview mirror, noticing the tension in Tyler's eyes. Don't worry, Shaq said, his deep voice resonating in the quiet of the car. Tyler startled. What? Ask me anything, I know you're worried. The boy hesitated for a moment, but then took a deep breath, as if gathering all his courage. Do you really want us to stay with you? Shaq kept his hand steady on the wheel, his gaze firm. It's not about wanting. I need you both here. Tyler fell silent, as if trying to understand the full meaning of those words. Then he looked down at Eva, whose tiny hand was still clutching his shirt, even in her sleep. He swallowed hard and nodded. The automatic gate opened, as the car pulled into Shaq's large estate. The yellow light from the windows reflected on the pool outside. The house was huge but warm, not cold, filled with a sense of safety and comfort that Tyler had never known. Eva rubbed her eyes sleepily, asking, where are we? Shaq picked her up as if she were a feather pillow. Our home. Eva looked up at him, her big eyes wide. Our home. Shaq nodded. She smiled, then buried her head in his shoulder, as if all the world's burdens had disappeared. Tyler walked in behind them, standing at the door, cautiously surveying the house. He had lived in fear for too long, used to sleepless nights, haunted by a father who didn't deserve the title. But here he felt true safety. The first days in the new house were a big change for both kids. Ava, who was used to sleeping in the cold and dark, now had a warm bed with a teddy bear and soft blankets. But every night she still woke up. Halfway through sneaking to find Shaq. One night, Shaq woke up to find her standing at the door, holding her teddy bear with wide eyes. "Uncle," she whispered, her voice trembling. Shaq reached out for her. "Come here." Ava didn't hesitate and jumped into his arms. She buried her face in his chest and whispered, "No one can hurt me anymore, right?" Shaq stroked her hair, his voice steady. No one." Ava closed her eyes, sleeping soundly for the first time in her life. In the arms of someone she truly trusted. For Tyler things weren't easy at first. He kept his distance from Shaq, as if still afraid that this good life might be temporary. But one thing helped him open up. Little by little, basketball. One evening Shaq took Tyler to the backyard, where there was a hoop taller than Tyler's head. He tossed a ball toward him. "Wanna give it a try?" Tyler hesitated. "I've never played before." Shaq shrugged. "I'm not that good at it either." Tyler laughed. "You're Shaquille O'Neal." Shaq winked. "Well, I'm not too bad." Tyler chuckled then for the first time. He tried throwing the ball. It didn't go in the hoop, but Shaq didn't mind. What mattered was that Tyler had tried. And from that day on, every evening, Tyler and Shaq practiced together. One night as Shaq sat in the living room watching TV, Tyler came over and tugged on his shirt. Shaq turned. "What's up, kid?" Tyler hesitated, biting his lip. He looked down at his feet, then back up at Shaq. His face was more serious than usual. "Can I call you Uncle Shaq?" Shaq paused for a few seconds. He wasn't Tyler's father, and he wasn't trying to replace that role. But hearing this question, something in his heart cracked open, and filled with warmth he had never known before. He smiled gently, extending his hand. "Of course." Tyler took his hand, gripping it tightly for the first time, with all his trust that evening. As Shaq sat on the sofa, watching Eva clutch the teddy bear she had named Mr. Shaq, and saw Tyler sitting beside him, waiting for him to turn on the TV for the NBA game, he knew that he had found something he never thought he needed: a real home. The villa was filled with warmth, as the golden light from the windows illuminated the wide front yard. The cold of winter slipped through the gusts of wind. But inside the house, the atmosphere was cozy and livelier than ever. Shaq walked through the door, carrying a giant Christmas tree on his shoulder, almost as tall as his massive frame. The fresh pine scent filled the air, spreading throughout the large space. Tyler and Ava's eyes widened, as they stood in the living room, jumping with excitement, when they saw the massive tree being brought in. "Uncle Shaq, this tree is huge!" Tyler exclaimed, his eyes sparkling. "It must be as tall as a building." Eva shouted in delight, hugging Shaq's leg. Shaq laughed heartily, setting the tree down in the middle of the living room, then dusting his hands. "Don't you think? Our first Christmas, we'll have the biggest tree in the city." Lauren came out of the kitchen, holding 2 cups of hot chocolate. She looked at the tree, then at Shaq, her gaze full of warmth. "You've done so much for the kids." Shaq shrugged, taking a cup and feeling the warmth on his skin. "I'm just doing what I should." Lauren smiled softly but didn't say anything more. She knew that for Shaq, actions spoke louder than words. The whole family gathered around the tree, each person helping with the decorations. Eva stood on tiptoe trying to reach the higher branches, but couldn't. Tyler stood next to her, carefully hanging the sparkling ornaments. Lauren gently placed red ribbons on each branch. Shaq sat on the floor, helping Eva tie ribbons to the lower branches. I want to put the star on top," Ava shouted after finishing the other decorations. Shaq laughed, lifting her up with one hand, as if she were no heavier than a small pillow. Eva placed the glittering, golden star on top of the tree, her eyes sparkling when Shaq set her down. The whole family stepped back to admire their creation. "The most beautiful tree ever." Tyler nodded, his face full of pride. Shaq folded his arms and agreed. "A great team always creates something wonderful." The room was quiet for a brief moment, as if everyone was savoring this rare, warm feeling. Lauren looked at Shaq, her voice soft but sincere. "We're a family now, right?" Shaq turned, meeting her gaze. He looked down at Tyler and Eva, the two children, who had become an inseparable part of his life. Without hesitation he bent down, lifting both of them onto his shoulders, making them burst out laughing in surprise. "That's right, kid. We're a team." Laughter echoed through the villa, blending with the twinkling Christmas lights on the tree. Outside, snow began to fall, gently covering the trees, creating the perfect scene for the first Christmas night. One that everyone knew would mark the beginning of something even more beautiful than a holiday season. The quiet Christmas night stretched across the neighborhood of villas, the sky full of twinkling stars, snow covering the path, reflecting the warm glow of the golden lights. Inside the house, Shaq sat on the porch holding a cup of hot cocoa, with a thin stream of steam rising, blending into the biting cold of winter. The warmth from the cup warmed his large hands, but his mind drifted to distant memories. In the front yard, Tyler was practicing basketball, each shot growing more accurate. The boy was sweating, even though the cold air surrounded him, but it didn't make him stop. Every time the ball hit the hoop and spun, before falling through, Tyler clenched his fist, his eyes lighting up with excitement. Shaq watched it all, his gaze both serious and full of pride. He remembered himself as a child, a boy much larger than his peers, feeling out of place in the world, unsure where he belonged. Just like Tyler now. He used to stand on the basketball court, struggling to find his path. But unlike Tyler, he had been lonely, without anyone by his side to guide him, to encourage him, to remind him that he wasn't alone. The door behind him opened, and the sound of light footsteps echoed on the wooden floor. Lauren appeared wearing a thick sweater, her hands tucked in her pockets to keep warm. She walked over, sat down next to him, and watched Tyler practicing intently. She didn't speak immediately. She simply sat there, sharing the peacefulness of the moment with him. "You've changed, Shaq." Her voice was gentle, but there was a certainty in every word. Shaq didn't reply right away. He took a sip of the cocoa, letting the warmth spread in his mouth, then smiled softly. Lauren tilted her head, observing him closely. "You used to not want to get close to anyone. You always kept your distance. But now, you have two kids who trust you more than anyone else." Shaq placed the cup of cocoa beside him, looked at Tyler, then turned to Lauren. "I didn't think I could do this. Take care of someone, become a pillar for others." But he paused, his eyes softening. "The kids made me realize I can't keep being alone." Lauren smiled. She understood better than anyone how Shaq had isolated himself in the past. But now the man sitting next to her was no longer the Shaq of years before. He had changed, no longer just a basketball star who knew only the court and the spotlight of the NBA, but a man who had found new meaning in his life. Tyler ran up to the porch, breathing heavily from exhaustion, but with a beaming face. Uncle Shaq, I made 3 shots in a row. Did you see? Shaq laughed, patting Tyler on the back. Great job, kid. But there's still a long way to go. Tyler nodded, his excitement obvious. As though nothing could make him happier at this moment. He turned to Lauren and smiled brightly. Mom, Uncle Shaq said. We're a team, and a team always sticks together, right? Lauren looked at her son, then at Shaq. She nodded gently, that's right. A team never abandons each other. Shaq felt something warm stir in his chest. It was no longer the emptiness he had carried for so many years. No longer the feeling of being lost. Even when surrounded by thousands of fans. He had found something he never thought he needed. A family. He reached out and patted Tyler's head. Then pulled him into a hug. You're right, we're a team. And a team never lets anyone face things alone. Tyler rested his head on Shaq's chest. While Ava ran out of the house. Wrapping her arms around his legs, as if she didn't want to miss this moment. Lauren looked at the scene. Her eyes filled with gratitude. Outside, the winter night continued to unfold. But for them there was no more coldness. Inside the villa, the sparkling Christmas lights reflected off the glass. Ornaments hanging from the towering tree. The room was filled with warmth. The soft crackling sound from the fireplace, blending with the scent of freshly baked gingerbread. Creating an atmosphere of rare tranquility. Eva sat curled up on the rug in front of the fireplace. Hugging the teddy bear Shaq gave her. Her head resting on the arm of the sofa. Her eyes sparkled as she gazed up at the large tree, where the twinkling lights danced in the darkness. The door burst open, a gust of cold air rushing in. Before Shaq closed it, Tyler ran into the house. His cheeks flushed red from the cold. Breathing heavily but his eyes full of joy. Uncle Shaq, I made 3 baskets in a row. The boy yelled proudly, as if he had just scored in an NBA final. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Placed his thick gloves on the table. And looked at Tyler with a curious gaze. Unable to hide his smile. 3 in a row, I don't believe it. Tyler stomped his feet, raising both hands. As if to prove it with his whole body. I really did, I swear. Shaq burst out laughing. Bent down to ruffle the boy's hair. Then suddenly lifted Tyler. As if he weighed no more than a basketball. Tyler screamed in surprise, but quickly started laughing. Wrapping his arms around Shaq's neck. You're awesome, kid. Shaq patted Tyler's back. His voice filled with pride. Keep practicing and you'll be better than me. Tyler beamed and Eva climbed onto the sofa. Reaching around Shaq's neck from behind, to give him a tight hug. Uncle Shaq is the best, she whispered. Pressing her cheek against his back. Shaq paused for a moment. Feeling the warmth from Eva. Her tiny hand gripping his shoulder, as if she never wanted to let go. He turned his head to look at Eva. Then at Tyler, and suddenly. His heart was filled with an emotion he had never known. It wasn't the sense of victory after a big game. Nor the admiration from millions of fans. This was something else deeper. More real, something he hadn't known he longed for. Until it appeared in his life. Lauren stood nearby silently watching. A gentle smile on her lips. She didn't say anything. Simply observing the man before her. The one who had once only known the glory of the court. Now surrounded by 2 kids who wouldn't let go. Her gaze was filled with gratitude. But there was also a touch of emotion. She knew in this moment Shaq was no longer an outsider. He was not just a protector. Not just a hero who appeared when they needed him. He had become a part of their family. A solid support for Tyler and Eva, and for her. Shaq set Tyler down on the floor. But the boy clung to his hand, while Eva nestled against his shoulder, as if it were the safest place in the world. Lauren walked over slowly, sitting beside them on the sofa, her eyes full of tenderness. Shaq looked up and caught her gaze, and he understood without needing a word. They both knew that after everything they had found, the most important thing they hadn't realized, they were missing a true family. The aroma of roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, and sweet pies wafted through the kitchen, blending with the lively laughter and chatter of two children. The fire in the fireplace crackled, spreading warmth that softened the cold winter air outside. The dining table was set with elegant white porcelain plates and crystal glasses, reflected the twinkling lights of the Christmas tree. Shaq sat at the head of the table, feeling a mix of unfamiliarity and warmth. As he looked around, on his right was Lauren, the woman who had once been an important part of his past. And now they were connected again, in a way no one could have expected. Beside her, Tyler and Eva were eagerly waiting, their eyes shining with anticipation for the most special moment of Christmas Eve, the gift opening. "All right, kid. Time to see if Santa did his job right," Shaq said with a teasing smile, as he pushed a large gift box toward Tyler. Tyler hurriedly tore off the wrapping paper, his heart pounding as he saw the box inside. His eyes widened when he discovered a pair of official basketball shoes, black and gold, with the familiar signature right on the shoe's body. He looked up, almost unable to believe his eyes. "Uncle Shaq, these are shoes with your autograph." Shaq shrugged and chuckled lightly. "I figured it was time. You had a real pair of basketball shoes. And who knows? Maybe one day you'll wear them on an NBA court." Tyler squeezed the shoes tightly in his hands, his eyes shining with joy and emotion. The boy rushed to give Shaq a big hug, his small arms wrapped around the giant man. "Thank you, Uncle Shaq. This is the best Christmas ever." Eva, determined not to be outdone by her brother, quickly opened her gift. When she saw the dollhouse set with every little detail, she screamed with delight, and immediately ran into Shaq's arms, giving him a loud kiss on the cheek. "Uncle Shaq is the best," she cheered, her voice pure and full of happiness. Lauren sat quietly beside them, watching the moment unfold, her gaze gentle and deep over the years. She had never imagined she would have a peaceful Christmas like this. No more fear, no more loneliness, no more long nights filled with the dread that someone might take her children from her arms. And all of that was thanks to the man sitting right in front of her. She lifted her wine glass, her voice soft yet sincere. "Shaq, thank you for everything." Shaq paused for a moment, but then raised his glass as well, his eyes sparkling with joy he hadn't even realized before. He looked at Lauren, then at the two kids, busily spreading their toys on the floor. "No need to thank me," he said in a warm voice. "We're a team, remember?" Lauren smiled and Tyler and Eva chimed in together. "A team." Shaq leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, looking at everyone around him. Over the years, he had spent countless Christmases in solitude. No matter how many fans, big games, titles and money he had, there had always been a void in his heart that he couldn't fill. But tonight, for the first time, he felt complete. He was no longer a basketball legend living in the past. No longer a lonely man, focused solely on work and career. He had a family, a real family. The night was late, and the Christmas lights still flickered inside the mansion, reflecting through the windows like tiny stars. In the quiet night, the children had fallen into a deep sleep on the sofa. wrapped in soft blankets, hugging their stuffed animals tightly, their steady breaths softly echoing in the warm space. Shaq stood on the balcony, his gaze silently tracing the starry sky. His breath formed faint white mist in the cold winter air. But no matter how low the temperature dropped, he felt another kind of warmth seeping into every cell. The warmth of a family. Of a life he never imagined he would have. Lauren stepped out draped in a thick sweater, the cold winter breeze making her shiver slightly. She stopped beside him quietly, observing the large man, who had once belonged to the vibrant basketball courts, now standing peacefully in the night, lost in his own thoughts. She gently spoke, her voice soft but full of emotion. "Did you ever think you'd have a family like this?" Shaq shook his head, a faint smile appearing on his face. He didn't need to think, because the answer was already clear. "I used to think I wasn't cut out for this life," he admitted, his eyes still fixed on the distant stars. "But it turns out I was wrong." Lauren smiled a rare smile, full of peace that she hadn't had in many years. She slowly leaned on his shoulder, feeling the steadiness and warmth radiating from his large frame. They didn't need to say anything more. They both understood that all the pain and loss from the past had led them to this moment. A new beginning, a true home. Inside the house the Christmas lights still sparkled, reflected in the gifts just opened, half-drunk cups of cocoa, and the photos taken together on the coffee table. A symbol of hope, of reunion, of a life Shaq never thought he deserved. Shaq closed his eyes, took a deep breath, letting the coldness of the winter night blend with the warmth of contentment. This was no longer a large, empty mansion, this was home. This was family, and for Shaq, that was all he had ever been searching for. After all the ups and downs, Shaquille O'Neal not only protected Tyler and Eva from danger, but also found something he never thought he needed. A real family. From being a former NBA star with a solitary life, he became a father, a protector, and above all, an indispensable part of the lives of two children. Shaq's story reminds us that family isn't just about people who share the same blood, but about those who are always there for us, loving and protecting us unconditionally. Do you think Shaq would make a great father to Tyler and Eva? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this story, don't forget to like, share and subscribe, so you won't miss the next inspiring stories. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.